To bless that nation is not to blindly support them and give them a blank check. True friendship, true blessing involves speaking the truth and holding that nation, for example, accountable. So again, even if you believe that the promise of Genesis 12, verse 3, applies today to Jews individually or even to the nation of Israel, even if you believe that, it cannot mean that we blindly support every action of Israel, the Israeli government, and no matter what they do, we're just simply going to blindly support them. That is not even a fulfillment of Genesis 12:3, even if you believe that. Now, I don't believe that the promise of Genesis 12:3 is in effect today, and there are many even dispensationalists who would say it's coming, but it's not in effect today. This is the time of the Gentiles. Israel, God has set aside Israel for a time while he focuses his attention on the Gentiles. And in the future, God will redirect his attention to Israel. But again, even then, when God redirects his attention to Israel in a thoughtful dispensational system, that will mean that the nation of Israel as a whole, all the Jews of that nation, will convert to Christianity, will put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. So, my point here is that there is no eschatological rationale for supporting Israel today. Now, I'm going to argue I think we should support Israel. There are reasons, okay, so don't worry about that. But I'm saying it's not because of eschatology, and it's not because of Genesis 12:3, and it's not based on what you view as the future for national Israel in the millennial kingdom of God, if you hold to that position. Those are not reasons that ought to influence our Christian perspective. We can't quote Genesis 12:3 as a support for as a biblical support for America supporting Israel today. I don't believe. Nor can we point to if you hold to a future for national Israel. So what then ought to influence our Christian perspective? We need to have a perspective on Israel as we do of all the nations of the earth. Well, and that sort of gives it away right there. I believe that the answer to how Christians ought to view Israel today lies not in special revelation about Israel's future or eschatological hope or the Abrahamic covenant, but rather we ought to view the nation of Israel today based on God's common grace for all nations in this present age. In other words, I think the Christian position, just to summarize it in a very simple way, and then I'll dive into it a little bit, the Christian position is that we ought to treat Israel and view Israel like we treat and view all the nations of the earth today. So what do I mean by that? Well, the very idea of nation states comes from God. God is the one who ordained government to be an institution that preserves order in a fallen world. Government, nation states are supposed to protect their people and promote life. God knew that families would feud, they would fight over land, they would take matters of vengeance into their own hands. And so in Genesis chapter 9, God, in his covenant with Noah, establishes capital punishment. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And he established the whole notion of a city-state or a nation state in human government right there in the Noahic covenant of Genesis chapter 9. So organized nation states are good, God-given, ordained institutions that God has created for the protecting of human life. And those governments and nation states that fulfill that role, even when their leaders do not acknowledge God, are nevertheless doing what God intended. They are serving God's purposes even if they don't acknowledge him. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 emphasizes this when it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Governments have been instituted by God, and to the degree that governing leaders and nation states protect innocent life, promote justice, and punish evil, they are doing what God intended, even if they don't acknowledge it. The primary purpose of a God-ordained nation state in this age is to protect the life of its citizens and protect evil. Now, of course, no nation state does that perfectly, but that is the standard. And so as Christians, we ought to view our own nation and other nations through that lens, through the God-ordained purpose of a nation state. This is a common grace blessing that God has given even to unredeemed people. Even unredeemed people during this present age can be preserved, their life can be preserved, justice can be rewarded, and evil can be punished as an act of God's common grace in human government. Okay, so let's apply that principle now to how Christians ought to view the nation of Israel. Let's think about the nation of Israel for a moment. The nation of Israel, despite its imperfections, and I'll talk about that in a moment, is a parliamentary democracy. It's not a religious theocracy. The nation of Israel protects religious freedom for its citizens, which, and this is important for the modern conflict, is in stark contrast to nearly every other nation in the Middle East.